How strong are Aura and Mare Bellofiore? Well, that's more of a two-parter question because Aura and Mare don't quite have the same build. Like, Mare is an extremely powerful spellcaster, whose strength is said to rival even Shalltear's for the title of strongest floor guardian, while Aura is a very skilled ranger and beast tamer, who can bring the most vicious of creatures under her command. So I think it'd be best to talk about their builds separately, and who better to start off with than the timid younger brother, Mare, the unreliable disciple of nature. But first, this video was sponsored by Kurtzspell, a free-to-play 3D third-person anime-inspired PvE and PvP battle arena game. And as I said the last time I promoted them, this game is actually fun as hell. Not only does it look great with its anime-styled graphics and animation, but it also blends so well with the fantasy world that it's based in, almost like it's an extension of the Ruby universe. Not to mention that with its custom character creation system, you too can also design your favorite anime girl. Or guy, yeah, that's an option too. Then, the combat is also very fleshed out, as moves and attacks flow seamlessly into each other, providing for a lot of combo opportunities, which means that in both PvP and PvE, you have to be versatile with how you approach your enemy, especially in online battles. Luckily for my PvP matches, I somewhat knew what I was doing, so we were able to clutch out the win. Anyway, the game is in early access right now on Steam, and the devs are constantly improving upon what's already there. I think it's safe to say that you can definitely expect a lot more things from this game. So I highly recommend using the link in the description to try it out. Now, let's get back to the video. Mare and Aura are a type of elf known as a dark elf, a race of humanoid beings similar to the wood elves that are common in fantasy games. In traditional stories, elves were short creatures with pointy ears. Think Santa's Little Helpers. But elves in modern fantasy RPGs, including the fictional MMO Yggdrasil from Overlord, are often styled after the mythos constructed by J.R.R. Tolkien. They're beings that are just as tall as humans, but also more agile, slender, and beautiful. And they have a graceful and noble culture that is at one with nature and magic. Many of these traits were adopted by tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, then made their way onto early computer RPGs like Ultima and Baldur's Gate. They eventually became a mainstay of the genre when they were implemented in fantasy MMORPGs like World of Warcraft. But specifically in Dungeons & Dragons and other Western fantasy RPGs, dark elves are sometimes evil elf variants, also known as Drow. They normally make their homes underground or inside caves and tunnels rather than in trees and forests like their wood elf relatives. However, in Japanese fantasy fiction, dark elves are more often just dark-skinned elves, with no major cultural or personality distinctions to regular elves. Sometimes they can live in deserts or other hot, arid climates which tan their skin, but more often than not, they reside in forests just like their lighter-skinned counterparts. They just happen to have a darker complexion for some reason. Though it's not clear which variant that Maruyama, the author of Overlord, borrowed more heavily from. Now, their appearance is styled after a typical Japanese dark elf, with a slightly more brownish tan. A fun fact though, it's said in the novels that the Great Forest of Tob, which lies near Nazarick, was once populated by dark elves. So using this information, dark elves don't appear to be subterranean creatures, at least not in the world of Overlord, placing Aura and Mare farther from the idea of them being a typical Western dark elf. But as we discussed in the last video, Aura and Mare are quite evil by nature, and while this may be a result of Buku Buku Chagama's decision to give them a negative karma rating, it could also be that dark elves and Maruyama's Overlord are an inherently evil race by nature. Speaking of race, the Elvish one is classified as humanoid in Yggdrasil. Therefore, dark elves can't gain any racial levels, unlike the majority of denizens of Nazarick who are either demi-human or heteromorphic. As such, the humanoid races tend to come with fewer and smaller advantages and disadvantages. Their weaknesses weren't extremely obvious and easily exploitable like the heteromorphs, and their buffs merely boosted their capabilities and powers. This made them far more versatile and easier to play. Heteromorphs though could be much stronger, but at the same time, very vulnerable to a prepared enemy. Take for example the undead's many weaknesses to healing, holy attacks, and cleric's undead turning. Now, since Yggdrasil borrows so much from Dungeons & Dragons, it makes sense to talk about how elves and dark elves work in that game, as it more than likely relates to Mare and Aura's inherent abilities. So basically, both types of elves are generally more agile but less tough than other humanoids. They gain a bonus to dexterity, which is their ability to hit enemies with ranged attacks or dodge out of the way of certain attacks and various spells. In exchange, they get a penalty to what's called Constitution, something that affects their ability to resist certain effects like poison and disease, as well as reduces their overall health pool. Neither type of elves sleep, and thus they can't be put to sleep with magic or poison. Their minds are sharper too, making them slightly more difficult to bewitch or control with magic spells. On top of this, their sight and hearing are even more powerful, meaning they can hear sneaking foes, spot hiding enemies, or search for secret doors and hidden treasures much more easily. Then, Dark Elves have a selection of additional abilities over and above their basic elven counterparts. To start with, they're actually more intelligent and charismatic, making them better at being spellcasters and clerics. They gain a special supernatural defense known as spell resistance, which gives them a good chance to outright ignore the effects of any spell, with the exact chance being based on their level and how powerful the enemy spellcaster is. Furthermore, their minds are even more resistant to influence and control than elves, and they gain a further bonus to all mind-altering attacks. These include the indirect ones like illusions, as well as effects that aren't technically spells, like psychic abilities. Then, they also have access to a few relatively simple, weak spells, mostly revolving around the creation of magical light and darkness, though those can only be used once a day. Dark Vision is also an ability that they have which allows them to always see up to around 120 feet in any direction, even in pitch black darkness. As creatures who are sometimes born and live in caves where there is no natural source of light, this was pretty essential to functioning. Incidentally, this is also why their eyes glow in a dim light, like certain nocturnal animals. Though this ability to see in the dark normally comes with a cost, as in they're easily blinded by bright light sources. Regardless, it wouldn't be surprising if Aura and Mare possessed all of these additional advantages, but ultimately, we only know for a fact that they possess dark vision, assumed to be without any supposed bright light weaknesses. I mean, they don't appear to demonstrate any difficulty seeing outdoors during bright sunny days. And as floor guardians of floor 6, they would be spending the majority of their time in a brightly lit coliseum on a floor with a functioning day-night cycle. Overall though, as elves, they're likely more resistant than their humanoid counterparts to various types of mind-altering spells. But since Dark Elves are a humanoid race, they don't have racial levels, meaning in Yggdrasil, all of their advantages and bonuses wouldn't be that much better than any of the other humanoid races, including their fellow elves. It would seem that both elves and dark elves most likely gain a slight boost to their observation abilities, especially thanks to their good vision, and then they may be more resistant to certain kinds of spells, but they don't have any particularly powerful abilities or weaknesses like the other races that we've discussed in this series so far. We also know very little about their classes, but as usual, that's not going to stop us. It's still enough to speculate a little bit. And of course, we can always rely on the fact that Maruyama borrowed heavily from Dungeons & Dragons in order to give us a bit of an idea. So, as I said in the beginning, let's start with the younger brother of the two, Mare. Mare's class archetype is actually that of a druid. Specifically, he has 10 levels in druid, 10 levels in High Druid, 10 levels in Nature's Herald, 5 levels in Disciple of Disaster, and 10 levels in Forest Mage, with another 55 levels unaccounted for. And although we mentioned this in a prior video involving one of the 5 worst, Druid is a class that specializes in nature-related spells, usually nature-themed buffs, controlling plants, manipulating the earth, and summoning and controlling various animals. The word itself comes from a kind of high-ranking priest from ancient Celtic religions. It became quite popular in fantasy fiction and video games to signify divine spellcasters whose powers, unlike clerics, were not derived from a god but rather nature itself. They had various capabilities, depending on how high of a level you were. You could befriend wild animals, recruit an animal companion to fight in battle with you, move through restrictive or dangerous terrain with ease, gain bonuses to specific nature-related skills, have immunity to being tracked, resistance to spells cast by fairies, immunity to poisons, or even have the ability to moderately adjust your appearance at will. That being said though, the author of Overlord did list Albedo, Demiurge, and Sibas as the only 3 NPCs with the ability to actively transform as a class ability, which would suggest that druids in Overlord, or at least Mare's version of druid, doesn't share this capability with their D&D cousins. Similarly, most of these other class capabilities haven't even been confirmed in Overlord, so it's possible that druids in Yggdrasil may not have even had most of these special abilities. It's just something to keep in mind so that you know what's not outside of the realm of possibility. What we do know is that he does have animal companions, specifically a pair of extremely high-level dragons, one of which he and Aura rode into Djirkniv's capital city on. These dragons were obtained from one of Yggdrasil's gacha games, which, if you weren't aware, is basically Japan's version of loot boxes. Yggdrasil's monetization scheme was notoriously exploitative, and it was possible to spend money on these gacha lotteries to obtain various in-game benefits like gear or creatures. I mean, it was practically pay to win. But back to the ability itself. In Dungeons & Dragons, rangers and druids could only have regular animals as companions, with the strength of the animal dependent on the level of the character. A high-level player might have a wolf, tiger, or dinosaur, while a low-level player might have a dog, eagle, or snake. It wasn't meant to be a full-on class feature, just a nice little bonus that made the classes seem more nature-oriented. Yggdrasil, on the other hand, as it usually does, seems to make this skill much more powerful, allowing it to apply to much more powerful, high-level magical beasts, like dragons, and also apparently allowing 2 rather than just 1 companion. The recruitment probably wouldn't work against anything too humanoid, particularly any playable race, as well as anything that was too monstrous. That means things like angels, demons, slimes, constructs, undead, and giants are all probably out. It might work on plant creatures, fairies, or elementals, but that's also not a guarantee. Think animals, dragons, or things that kind of look like animals, like the Barghest from Season 3. Now, the most important class ability of druids, and the one that we see most prominently in Overlord, is their robust selection of nature-related spells. While it's not been specified exactly what kind of spells that Mare might specialize in, we can speculate a good deal on what that may be. For instance, we've seen him use some kind of earthquake-esque spell on screen to kill a bunch of Djirkniv's royal guard. This, likely being the earthquake spell, affects an 80-foot radius around the designated origin point, and it causes intense tremors, which produces various effects dependent upon the terrain. In a city, buildings and tunnels would collapse, trapping and crushing characters caught inside them. On open terrain, fissures in the earth expand, and anyone who doesn't react fast enough can fall inside and also get crushed. If you're in a body of water, these fissures would form whirlpools, pulling creatures down to the bottom and possibly drowning them. Muddy terrains likewise turns to quicksand and pulls characters in, though it's not a very good spell against high-level characters, because the potency of the attack doesn't scale much at all with your character level. However, it is a very efficient and effective spell for killing large groups of weaklings. We also know that he has the 6th level terrain manipulation spell called Earth Surge, which functions very similarly to the 6th level D&D spell Move Earth. This spell can't affect rock, but it can move dirt and other loose earth substances like clay and sand as if it were a very sluggish and viscous wave of liquid. The overall reach of the change allowed one to move an area of earth that was approximately 150 feet in length and width into whatever shape that the caster wanted every 10 minutes or so. Of course, assuming that the end result was something that would remain structurally stable after the effect had ended. Those end results would typically be a smoothly curving hill or a flat plain. It doesn't violently break the ground like an earthquake, nor is it quick enough to trap or bury creatures like quicksand. In fact, structures, creatures, and other objects that occupy the terrain, such as trees, are mostly unaffected, magically shifting up or down with the surface of the terrain. In Yggdrasil, the exact area of effect might be different, but apparently, Mare is able to affect a distance of around 350 feet across, or just over 100 meters. Though, at the time that he was noted doing that, he was also using one of his class skills. Regardless though, the rough effect of moving Earth remains the same. Mare also may have been responsible for the 6th tier weather manipulation spell called Control Weather, the one that we saw Nazarick use to intimidate the Lizardmen back in Season 2. This allows the caster to freely manipulate all aspects of the weather, producing powerful effects like tornadoes, thunderstorms, heat waves, torrential rain, hailstorms, sleet, fog, blizzards, flash frosts, and so on, as well as allows you to remove these effects and produce more mild ones like overcast or sunny days. But that's yet to be confirmed. It just fits most accordingly with Mare's build. Now, one interesting facet of druids that's commonly found in D&D but we haven't really talked about was that they're also very skilled at fighting. Many of their spells were traditional buff spells, and like I said, druids in Dungeons & Dragons would often combine these with their transformation ability to make themselves extremely powerful. Yggdrasil doesn't have transformations per se, but it's possible druids are meant to be better warriors than spellcasters. The reason I propose this is because Mare's base stats are actually extremely well balanced. As a matter of fact, he has some of the highest stats total amongst all the known NPCs, tied with Albedo at 690. This puts him below only one other NPC whose stats are actually known, Shalltear at 732. That said, Gargantuous is even higher, placing his stats at the highest of all the NPCs. Similarly, Rubedo probably had even better stats than that. Aside from that though, while Mare's physical attack is still a bit lower than his magical attack, he might still make for a decent hybrid character if he buffs himself with some abilities. I mean, even with his appearance making him look like some kind of wizard with just a cloth armor dress skirt and a staff, he's not nearly as weak or squishy as you might think. Now, what about the rest of his classes? So we've explained druid for the most part, and higher druid is probably just a higher tier upgrade of that, enhancing all druid related powers and granting access to higher leveled spells. But what about nature's herald? That one seems a bit interesting. Herald is a term for the messenger of a king or monarch, essentially fulfilling the role of a modern ambassador or a diplomat. It also has some religious connotations. In Christianity, for instance, God is said to employ many different angels as his heralds. Herald, especially as a class, is usually used in this religious connotation for most different fantasy RPGs. Clerics, for instance, could communicate directly to their gods and be given instructions, some of which would be to act as heralds in order to give others instructions or blessings. And with druid magic being classified as divine magic, one that's powered by the druid's spiritual communion with the natural world, it's likely that nature's herald improves upon the more cleric-like abilities of druids, mainly their healing and buffing spells, making them stronger, more potent and effective, less costly, and granting access to better variations. One of Mare's known buff spells is actually called the Power of Gaia, Gaia being the Greek pantheon, the personification of planet Earth as a primordial goddess, which explains why it might be a fitting spell for a Herald of Nature to use, and it seems to be a spell that provides some kind of strength enhancement. It's also likely that her main AoE healing spells also come from this class. Then we have the Forest Mage class, which is also pretty interesting. It really just does sound like a synonym for Druid, doesn't it? But Druids weren't just focused on plants or trees, rather it was all of nature, including things like oceans, mountains, the sky, deserts, and so on. They even had influence over the primal elements of earth, fire, water, and air. In light of this fact, a Forest Mage might just be a derivative class of Druid that focuses on enhancing and broadening their plant-related abilities. After all, Buku Buku Chagama had written in his bio that Mare liked plants, so perhaps she gave him this as a compliment to that bit of flavor text. As for its abilities, perhaps this class allows him to summon plant creatures, bind his enemies with vines, or maybe even animate trees and other plant-like creatures to fight for him. It seems to also be useful for utility. In D&D, there exists a druid spell called Tree Stride, which allows the caster to enter into a tree and exit out of another one that's hundreds or thousands of feet away, giving the ability to jump repeatedly between trees a number of times based on the caster's skill. In a similar vein, Mare has a buff spell called Woodland Stride, which seems to be used to increase the target's mobility and maybe even provide a similar effect. Or it might just increase the user's running speed over woodland terrains. Who knows? Regardless, whether offensive, defensive, or utility, there are likely many plant or wood-related spells that are probably the providence of forest mages. And finally, Mare has a class known as Disciple of Disaster. This sounds suspiciously similar to Obert Elaine Odol's signature class, World Disaster, which was a secret class that you could only get by killing its previous owner. And it allowed the user to use large amounts of MP to power up their spells way past their normal limit, granting the ability to deal massive quantities of damage in an extremely short period of time. Now, this class might not be as secret as World Disaster, and it may not even bear any similarities in function to each other, but the name does suggest that it provides extremely destructive, powerful abilities. So what exactly could it be referring to? Well, think about it. What do you get when you combine nature with disaster? Well, you get a natural disaster. Yep, it's our theory that this class powers up some of the more destructive abilities in the Druid's repertoire, specifically the ones that produce natural disasters like earthquakes, lightning storms, whirlwinds, and so on. So that's literally everything about Mare's classes. Now let's finish off this power profile by looking at his selection of weapons. Mare's go-to piece of equipment is his staff, a divine class weapon called the Shadow of Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil, aside from being the name of the video game that AniNews was playing, is actually a reference to the world tree in Norse mythology. It's said to be the origin of the universe itself. In the game world, this idea was adopted into the lore. The 9 playable servers in the game are the 9 remaining leaves on the world tree. All other leaves were either eaten by the World Eater or fell from the tree and turned into world items. Incidentally, this is why world items are called, well, world items. They are literally as powerful as an entire world. In any case, the Shadow of Yggdrasil would presumably be an item that was derived from this world tree in some way. It's probably not an actual branch of the tree itself, as that would make it about as powerful as a world item, which it isn't. Rather, perhaps it could be seeds or leaves of Yggdrasil that fell and sprouted newer, smaller trees in its shadow. Thus the name Shadow of Yggdrasil, a divine class item that is but a small portion of a much larger world-class tree. Aside from this cool lore theory, we really don't know much about it other than its use in bashing in people's knees or creating earthquakes. Staffs in Yggdrasil worked much like Dungeons & Dragons, in that they could be used to cast spells like a scroll or wand, except the user could select from a much larger selection of spells, not just one. Additionally, in a feature exclusive to Yggdrasil, they also improved the user's spellcasting ability. They weren't actually necessary to cast the spells, but they would make them much more powerful. Then, though not exactly Mare's personal possession, she has been seen to wear the pair of gauntlets called Avarice and Generosity, an actual world item, ranking it as one of the most powerful pieces of equipment in the game for its practically game-breaking abilities. It's one of the few world items that was obtained by the guild Ainz Ul Gown. This particular one had the dual ability of creating and administering XP. The black gauntlet, Avarice, absorbed the souls of slain creatures and converted it into XP. Then the white gauntlet, Generosity, gave the user the ability to use that XP to power any spell that they wanted, including the most powerful ones like Ainz's Wish or various resurrection spells. It was very useful for players who were already at the highest level. It allowed them to stockpile large quantities of experience, giving them a pool of XP that wouldn't take away from their current level. That said, it might require the user to actually be the one to kill the enemy in order to absorb any souls, because in the light novel, we aren't actually told how these gauntlets manage to absorb anything. And that brings us to the end of everything that you need to know about Mare's build, powers, abilities, and equipment. He may not be the strongest in Nazarick, but he is definitely a top tier spellcaster. And it's a shame that we've only seen so little of his potential abilities. I'm sure there's a good reason as to why Ainz always brings him along whenever he's about to engage an enemy. But oh well, guess we just gotta wait for the next unfortunate army to approach Nazarick's gates. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Kurtspell for sponsoring this video. Once again, I thoroughly enjoyed playing this game, and if you're the least bit interested, then I highly recommend checking it out using the link in the description. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!